There hasn't been many more surprising things to happen this offseason than Malik Willis falling to the 3rd round at the draft to the Titans. Some analysts had him going as high as 2nd overall, but clearly teams viewed him differently. Now, Willis has a chance to step into a Titans team that's at a bit of a crossroads this year after trading away its top receiver and having the option to dump their current starting quarterback after the season. Willis was a 3-star recruit coming out of high school and committed to play at Auburn, where he didn't really end up getting a lot of playtime. He only ended up spending 2 years there and threw only 14 passes, but was more of a threat in the run game with 28 carries. Ultimately, he just wasn't going to get a lot of playtime, and he knew that, and that's why he decided to transfer to Liberty. Willis had to sit out in 2019 because of the transfer rules, but once he was allowed to play, he was named the Flames starter. He ended up having a really good season. Liberty went 9-1, and Willis threw for 2,250 yards and 20 touchdowns to 6 interceptions. Plus, he had 944 yards and found the end zone 14 times on the ground. Now, the Flames weren't nearly as good in 2021, but Willis was still great. He threw for over 2,800 yards and had 27 touchdowns to 12 interceptions. Rushing, he had 878 yards and 13 touchdowns. Willis showed a lot of talent during his time at Liberty, but more than anything, he showed that he was just a crazy freak athlete with his elite speed. He was best when he was using his legs and had the ability to make defenders miss. When plays broke down, he was not only good, but super fun to watch. He was able to make something out of nothing, and even with his arm, he could make off-platform throws. Willis will always try to extend a play, and sometimes that did bite him in the ass. He'll make a bad play worse every once in a while, and he struggled timing throws in anticipation at Liberty, and above all else, he played in the most basic elementary system that was mainly just run-pass option and 3-man route concepts, and that leaves plenty of questions about his offensive knowledge. Willis is a guy that was said to not just be a 1st-round pick, but was projected as high as 2nd overall. But clearly teams had their concerns because he slid all the way to the 3rd round of the draft to the Titans. In the Titans' first preseason game, Malik Willis ended up getting the start against the Ravens, and I'd say it went pretty well. He honestly made a lot of good plays with his legs and even made 1st-rounder Kyle Hamilton look silly on his first touchdown on what was a pretty impressive run. He was a solid passer too, completing 6 of 11 passes for 107 yards. There was definitely some promise, but it came with a big caveat. Mike Vrabel actually ended up benching Willis earlier than planned because of some frustrations with him. Vrabel seemed annoyed post-game about Willis being too hesitant to pass the ball. Vrabel said he needs to be more decisive and to throw the ball when the guys are open. He also mentioned his timing and release and that they had to take a look at that. Willis even said after the game that he can't continue to rely just on his legs to make plays. And that was Willis's focus in the Titans' 2nd preseason game. Stay in the pocket. He said after the game against the Buccaneers that he felt good about his pocket presence. Willis claimed that he felt more comfortable and that he needed to understand when to stay in the pocket and when to not, but it's a growing process. He only took off and ran 5 times, but his passing numbers weren't very good. Willis was just 7 for 17 for 80 yards with a touchdown. Now, he didn't throw an interception, but he did get sacked 3 times during the game. The Titans' last preseason game comes against the Cardinals, and then it's just going to turn into a waiting game until we see Malik Willis again. The reality is, the Titans already have their quarterback, Ryan Tannehill. How long is that going to last though? I mean, I guess we'll find out because Tennessee is going to have a huge decision to make this next offseason. The Titans really couldn't do anything this offseason with Tannehill. He would have been a $57.4 million dead cap, but there is an out after 2022. Tennessee can decline it and only deal with $18.8 million in dead cap. And I have to imagine that played a huge role in the Titans drafting Malik Willis. Well, that, and he's been disappointing. Last year, Tennessee was still good. They ended up going 12-5 despite Derrick Henry getting hurt and Tannehill not having the greatest season. He threw for over 3,700 yards and 21 touchdowns to 14 interceptions. Credit where it's due though, Tannehill did have 7 rushing touchdowns for the 2nd straight year. That's not exactly what you'd expect from a dude as mobile as Tannehill, but he can surprise you. He's had his moments in Tennessee, but the reality is, the Titans have won games with Tannehill, but it hasn't been because of Tannehill. And that's probably why Tennessee felt the need to find its next quarterback in the draft. Aside from potentially moving on from Ryan Tannehill this next offseason, it's been made pretty damn clear that the Titans are in a sort of rebuild, or at the very least, a kind of retooling. That was made very clear when the Titans traded away A.J. Brown. Tennessee drafted him in 2019, and he had back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons to start his career. He was still a stud last year, and then all the talk became about his contract. Clearly, the Titans didn't want to shell out the money to keep him around and opted to trade him to the Eagles for a first-round pick. Philadelphia was willing to give him that monster 4-year, $100 million deal that he wanted, and meanwhile, the Titans used that pick 18th overall on Treylon Burks. Treylon Burks was the best recruit in the state of Arkansas coming out of high school, and he decided to stay home, committing to Arkansas. He started most of the Razorbacks games in 2019 and ended up being named to the SEC All-Freshman team after he had 475 yards. During the messy COVID season, Burks ended up being Arkansas's #1 wide receiver. In 8 games, he recorded 820 yards and 7 touchdowns. Burks was second team All-SEC for technically the second straight year, but for the first time as a wideout. Finally, he was first team All-SEC as a junior. Burks had 1,104 yards and 11 touchdowns and decided to skip Arkansas's bowl game for the draft. Now, Burks has the chance to step into a huge role in Tennessee with the absence of A.J. Brown. Burks is likely going to be the #2 behind Robert Woods, who the Titans actually traded a 6th-round pick for this offseason from the Rams. Woods is coming off of a torn ACL in 2021, but in the 3 years before that, he played in almost every game and had over 3,000 yards. He's sure to be a great veteran presence there in Tennessee. There's also going to be plenty of intrigue at the tight end position with Austin Hooper. He signed a 1-year deal this offseason after he just wasn't as good as expected in Cleveland. Hooper was a stud in Atlanta for a few years, but we haven't really seen an elite Austin Hooper since 2019. The good news for whoever's behind center, Derrick Henry is back, and the Titans are probably just going to continue to run the offense through him. Henry tore his ACL last year, but he was just insane in 2020. He was the Offensive Player of the Year after he rushed for 2,027 yards and 17 touchdowns. Both were the most in the league. Henry is a game changer, and a lot of people have forgotten just how good he is. But there is the slight chance that he isn't the Henry of old. The Titans' offensive line is projected to be one of the worst in the NFL this season. Even the best name on the line, Taylor Lewan, hasn't been the same player since he tore his ACL in 2020. Bottom line, Derrick Henry may not be as good as we remember, Taylor Lewan already isn't, A.J. Brown is gone, and Ryan Tannehill is likely entering his last year in Tennessee. The Titans' future is riding on Malik Willis.